It was a rainy Monday morning in Savannah, Georgia, the kind of morning that clings to your skin and soul alike. I stood by the window of our old Victorian home, the kind my late husband Charles used to say had good bones, watching streaks of rain race each other down the glass. Everything felt quieter since he passed. Too quiet, in fact. That house had always carried the sounds of life. His humming in the kitchen, our laughter echoing in the hallway, the warm clink of teacups on porcelain. Now it only held the weight of memories. 3 weeks had passed since Charles's heart gave out on the back porch, just like that. He was watering the herbs wearing that worn-out baseball cap he refused to part with when it happened. I ran to him the moment I heard the sound of the watering can hitting the wooden planks. But when I reached him, he was already gone. I hadn't stopped grieving since. Today was the reading of his will. That word alone felt foreign to me, cold and formal. Will. Like something meant for strangers. But Charles had always promised to take care of me even after he was gone, and I believed him. I was up early, dressed in a simple black dress, hair pulled back, just a touch of makeup to hide the sleepless nights. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the leather-bound folder he'd once handed me and said, "Just in case, Eleanor, you never know what the future holds." Back then, I had laughed, brushed it off. Charles was the planner, the preparer. I was the one who trusted things would work out. But now, as I stood in his study, I realized this was the just in case. On the mantel sat photos of our life together. The day we opened our first pharmacy, our wedding on Tybee Island, our trip to Sedona for our 20th anniversary. But there was one face always at the edges of those memories. His son from his first marriage, Blake. Blake had never accepted me. From the moment Charles introduced me as his fiancé, Blake's eyes had gone cold. I still remember his words years ago at a Thanksgiving dinner. "She's not my mother. She's just the woman who got lucky." I had tried, Lord knows I had. Birthday cards, homemade pies, even tutoring his kids. But the wall between us had never come down. Charles would always say, "He'll come around, Ellie. Just give him time." That time never came. And now that Charles was gone, I had a deep feeling Blake wasn't about to make things easier. In fact, he was going to fight me for everything.
The notary's office sat just off Chippewa Square in Savannah, a red brick building with white columns that had probably seen more family betrayals than the courthouse itself. I'd passed it 100 times before, but never imagined I'd walk through its doors with my heart clenched in fear. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always did. Charles used to tease me about that. "You'll beat the sun up one day, Ellie." But today, I wasn't just early. I was prepared. I had the folder he'd asked me to keep, the envelope marked private, and my wedding ring turning slowly on my finger as I waited to be called in. Blake arrived right on time, not a minute late. Of course he did. He walked in like a man who owned the room, his tailored navy suit screaming wealth and control. His wife, Danielle, followed behind him, tall and silent, with that expression she always wore, like everything around her smelled faintly of disappointment. Their 2 boys stayed in the car. That was telling. Blake didn't look at me, not even a nod. He just walked past, hands in his pockets, and said to the receptionist, "We're here for the Hollister will." Not my father's will, just the Hollister will. I felt the chill in that phrasing. Once inside, the notary, a firm but kind woman named Miss Cartwright, welcomed us with that carefully measured warmth professionals use when they know a storm is coming. She asked us to be seated, then opened the thick manila envelope resting on her desk. And then, as if he couldn't wait, Blake leaned forward and said it. "Let's make this quick. She knows Dad didn't leave her anything." I turned slowly toward him, blinking. He wasn't joking, not performing. He truly believed that. Miss Cartwright looked from him to me, clearly unsettled. And I didn't say a word. Because suddenly, I remembered something. 3 months before Charles died, we had tea on the back porch. He was quieter than usual, thoughtful. His hands trembled a little as he refilled my cup. "Ellie," he said, "do you ever think about what happens when I'm not around?" I said, "All the time," I answered truthfully. "Then promise me something," he whispered. "No matter what Blake says, no matter what he tries to do, you trust me. Just trust that I've taken care of it. You were my whole world." I had nodded, my throat too tight to speak. So now, as Blake leaned smugly in his chair, convinced I'd walk out of here with nothing, I simply folded my hands and whispered to myself, "I trust you, Charles," and waited for the will to be read. Miss Cartwright cleared her throat and unfolded the will with the care of someone defusing a bomb. The room stilled. Even Danielle stopped scrolling through her phone. I could feel Blake's impatience pulsing across the table. He leaned back in his chair, legs crossed, fingers tapping his knee, every movement screaming, "Get on with it!" Then Miss Cartwright began reading aloud. "I, Charles Edwin Hollister, being of sound mind and full capacity, do hereby declare this document to be my final will and testament." The legal language was cold, clinical, but my hands were already trembling. I glanced at the edge of the envelope Charles had once tucked into that folder. My name, Eleanor, written in his handwriting, still as steady as the day he proposed. "To my son, Blake Charles Hollister, I bequeath 25% of my total estate, including but not limited to business holdings, vehicles, and liquid assets." Blake sat forward. Just a twitch of the mouth, but I saw it. "To my wife, Eleanor May Hollister, I bequeath 75% of my estate, including full ownership of our family home, all associated properties, and control of my shares in Hollister & Co. Pharmaceuticals." The room went silent, like the air had been sucked from it. Blake's hand stopped tapping. Danielle's mouth dropped slightly open, and for once, she couldn't summon a single expression to hide behind. I stayed perfectly still. But inside, I was shaking, not from joy, not from triumph, but from disbelief, from love, from the knowledge that Charles hadn't just remembered me, he'd trusted me with everything. Then came the letter. Miss Cartwright reached for a second sheet, her voice softening as she read Charles's personal message. "To my beloved Elamar, if you're hearing this, I'm gone. But know this, my heart was always with you. I built my life twice, once before tragedy, and again with you. You didn't ask for any of this, but you stood beside me through everything. This company, this fortune, this house, it all means nothing without love. You gave me that. Let this be your security and your freedom. And to Blake, I hope someday you will understand why I made this choice. But if you can't, I trust that Eleanor will know what to do." I closed my eyes. I could feel the tears pushing against my lashes, but I didn't let them fall. "Blake?" He exploded. "This is a joke," he barked. "He was confused, drugged, manipulated." Miss Cartwright didn't even blink. Mr. Hollister's mental capacity was verified and recorded by 2 legal witnesses, a medical professional, and a videotaped statement signed 2 months prior to his death. Blake stood up, red-faced, and shoved his chair back so hard it scraped across the hardwood. "You'll regret this," he hissed. I looked up at him, this grown man who had never once called me family, and quietly said, "Charles regretted nothing."
After the will was read, I remained seated while Blake stormed out of the notary's office, his wife trailing behind, her heels clicking like warning shots down the hallway. The moment the door slammed behind them, silence wrapped around the room like a blanket, heavy, suffocating, and strangely intimate. Ms. Cartwright folded her hands gently. "Mrs. Hollister," she said, "do you need a moment?" I nodded, but didn't speak. My voice had splintered somewhere between grief and vindication. The truth was, I didn't feel victorious. Not yet. Because I knew my stepson. I had watched him grow from a boy filled with resentment into a man who wielded it like a weapon. And that man had just lost the war he thought he'd already won, which meant the real battle hadn't even started. That night, the rain came again, just as it had the morning of the will. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the very envelope Charles had instructed me to keep safe, now opened, now complete. The tea in my mug had gone cold. Outside, the streetlights shimmered on wet pavement. And then the knock came. 3 short raps, firm, purposeful. I opened the door to find Blake standing on my porch, soaked to the bone but full of fire. "You set this up, didn't you?" he spat before I could even speak. "You knew he changed the will." I stepped back instinctively, not out of fear, but from the sheer shock of seeing him like this, so unhinged, so raw. "I didn't know anything, Blake. Your father didn't want you to." He laughed bitterly. "You're not family. You never were. You think wearing that ring and cooking Sunday dinners made you his legacy?" I looked at him. Really looked. The expensive coat, the watch, the desperate eyes of a man whose world was slipping from his fingers. "No," I said. "Love did." He pointed a finger at me, shaking. "I'll contest it. I'll drag you through court. And when the truth comes out that you manipulated him, controlled him, I'll take back every cent." Then he turned and disappeared into the night. I closed the door quietly, locked it, and leaned against it with a trembling breath. He wasn't bluffing. And I knew this wasn't about money anymore. It was about revenge. The morning after Blake's visit, I woke up with a weight in my chest that no amount of coffee could ease. The house, which had once been full of Charles's warmth and light, now felt like a fortress under siege. Each photo on the walls reminded me of what we had built, what was now being threatened. I knew Blake wouldn't waste time, and neither could I. I drove across Savannah to the office of Daniel Grant, the attorney Charles had trusted for years. A quiet, intelligent man in his late 50s, with the kind of presence that made even the loudest people fall silent. Daniel greeted me at the door with a look that said he already knew. Blake's threats had likely traveled faster than the rain. We sat in his mahogany-paneled office, the smell of leather and aged books wrapping around me like a protective blanket. "You were wise to come," Daniel said gently. "I got a call this morning. Blake's attorney is requesting a copy of the full will and intends to file for contestation on grounds of undue influence and mental incapacity." I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. "Can they win?" Daniel shook his head. "Unlikely. Your husband's will was airtight, signed, witnessed, medically verified, even videotaped." Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. Charles was always one step ahead. He opened a small safe built into the wall behind his desk and pulled out a slender envelope, cream-colored, thick, sealed with a wax stamp. It was addressed to me in Charles's unmistakable handwriting. "He left this for you, said it should only be given to you if Blake challenged the will." My fingers trembled as I broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Inside, Charles's words wrapped around me like a final embrace. "My dearest Ellie, if you're reading this, it means Blake did what I feared he might.
I'm sorry, love. I had hoped age would bring him grace. I see now it brought him entitlement. That's why I created the clause. You remember the lake house? The place where we first vacationed after our wedding? I left something for you there. Something no court can touch. A safeguard. A truth Blake can never erase. If it comes to war, don't fight for money. Fight for the truth. That's what will set you free. See. I stared at the paper in silence. My heart ached with a strange blend of sorrow and hope. Charles had left me a final message, and possibly a weapon. We need to go to the lake house, I whispered. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Today? Before Blake does. The drive to the lake house felt like crossing into another life. Nestled at the edge of Lake Wisteria, just outside of Macon, Georgia, the cottage had always been our secret haven, a place untouched by the noise of business, inheritance, or complicated family politics. Just trees, water, silence, and each other. Charles loved it out there, said the stillness reminded him of what mattered. It was where we spent our first New Year's Eve together as husband and wife, where he surprised me with that awful handmade bookshelf, and where we both cried when we found out his cancer was in remission. I hadn't been back since his death. But now, I was returning not for memories, but for answers. Daniel followed behind in his car. The sky had turned gray again, as if even nature was holding its breath. The key was still under the chipped blue flower pot by the front door, just where Charles always kept it. I let myself in. The air smelled of cedar and dust and something else, something unmistakably his. My throat tightened. I walked past the stone fireplace, past the worn leather recliner he used to read in, until I reached the study. And there it was, the old oak desk. The bottom drawer, always locked. Daniel stepped in beside me as I reached into my purse and pulled out a brass key Charles had given me once, back when we were organizing our wills. He said it was for someday. Today was someday. The drawer creaked open. Inside was a small wooden box. Inside the box, two things. 1, a flash drive. 2, a sealed letter. This one wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Blake. I handed the drive to Daniel, without a word. He connected it to his laptop, his fingers moving swiftly. A video loaded. And there he was, Charles, alive, whole, sitting in this very study, the lake house behind him. If you're watching this, he began, his voice calm, then the worst has happened. And Blake, you're trying to destroy what little peace Eleanor has left. He paused, staring straight into the camera. Son, I love you, but love does not mean rewarding cruelty. It does not mean turning a blind eye to arrogance, entitlement, or greed. You've spent your life blaming others for your emptiness. But Eleanor, she never owed you anything. And still, she gave you kindness. If you are contesting this will, consider this my final living testimony. I was of sound mind. I made my decisions freely. And I chose Eleanor, not just as my wife, but as the one who truly saw me. The video ended. Daniel closed the laptop and looked at me. This isn't just a safeguard, he said quietly. It's a hammer. In any courtroom, this is your victory. But I didn't feel victorious. Not yet, because I still had one more choice to make. Whether to use the letter addressed to Blake or burn it. I sat alone that evening at the lake house, the sealed envelope still in my hands. The fire crackled softly in the hearth behind me, but I barely felt its warmth. My eyes were fixed on Charles's handwriting, steady, deliberate, unmistakably his. To Blake. A part of me knew I shouldn't read it. It wasn't mine. But another part, the part that had spent years being silently resented, accused, erased, that part wanted to understand what Charles had left unsaid between father and son. I broke the seal. The letter was short, just 3 paragraphs, but it hit like a hammer. Blake, if this letter reaches you, it means you chose to fight her, and that breaks my heart. You were my son. You still are, but I cannot pretend you didn't grow into a man I barely recognized. The money, it changed you. I thought if I kept giving, it would fill something in you. But I was wrong. Eleanor never asked for anything. She gave me everything. And when you finally demanded that I chose the person who loved me for who I was, not what I owned. If you continue to contest the will, know that I've left behind proof. But more importantly, know that I forgave you long before this day ever came. I only hope one day you'll learn to forgive yourself. Dad. I sat for a long time, the letter trembling in my hands, tears streaking my face without shame. It wasn't just a goodbye. It was a reckoning. The next morning, I returned to Savannah. The moment I stepped into Daniel's office, he stood up from behind his desk. "He's already filed the lawsuit," he said. "We've been served." I nodded and pulled the flash drive from my coat pocket. Then it's time we let Charles speak for himself. But deep down, I still wondered, if this ended in court, what would truly be won? Justice? Or just another broken piece of a family already shattered? It was a cold, cloudless Monday when the hearing began. I wore the same black dress I'd worn to Charles's will reading. Simple, understated, respectful. A small pearl pin he once gave me was fastened at my collar. I wanted to carry something of him with me. The courthouse in Savannah looked more like a church than a place for battle. Arched windows, stone pillars, polished oak benches. But I wasn't naive. I knew we weren't here for justice. We were here to see who could twist love into leverage. Blake sat at the other side of the room, flanked by a team of high-powered attorneys. Camille wasn't with him. Maybe she knew how ugly this would get, or maybe even she had limits. My only companion was Daniel Grant. He stood tall beside me, calm, composed, and prepared. But I felt the tremble in my own hands as the proceedings began. Blake's lawyers wasted no time. They painted me as manipulative, opportunistic. They cited my background as a psychologist as a weapon, implying that I had used subtle emotional tactics to gain undue influence over Charles. She isolated him, one attorney argued. She gradually erased his son from his life, replaced his trusted advisors, redirected decisions in her favor. I felt myself shrink inside, not from the accusations themselves, but from how coldly and confidently they were delivered, like a business pitch. And Blake, he sat behind them, stone-faced, eyes forward, as if I were no more than a hostile stranger. When it was our turn, Daniel rose slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply inserted the flash drive and played the video. The room fell into stillness as Charles's image filled the monitor, his voice clear, steady, warm, cut through every lie like a knife through silk. The room remained silent for a long moment after the video ended. Then Daniel spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, the only manipulation here is the one being performed now by a son who cannot accept that inheritance is not owed, but earned." The judge didn't rule that day. These things take time. But when I left the courthouse, something had shifted. People looked at me differently, not with pity, but with recognition. They saw me. And perhaps for the first time in his life, Blake did too. The trial had paused for deliberation. Weeks passed. The media had caught wind of the case. Local news outlets framed it as a battle for the $25 million legacy. A few even tried to reach out for interviews. I declined them all. I didn't want to become a spectacle. I just wanted peace. But peace, it seemed, was still a long way off. One Thursday morning, I received an unexpected visitor, Camille. She stood on my porch in a gray cashmere coat, her eyes tired, hair pulled back tightly. I hadn't seen her since the day of the will reading. "May I come in?" she asked softly. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. We sat in the sunroom, the late afternoon light casting golden slats through the blinds. I poured her tea, and for a moment, we just sat. Two women caught in the aftermath of one man's life. "He's unraveling," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Blake, this trial, it's consuming him. He hardly sleeps. He won't talk to the kids. He just keeps obsessing about what he deserves." I listened quietly. "I didn't come to defend him," she added quickly. "I know what he's doing is wrong, but Eleanor, I also know what it's doing to you. And I think," she paused, "I think you don't care about the money." I nodded. I never did. "Then let's end this. No more headlines, no more courtrooms. Blake won't apologize. I won't insult you with that. But he's willing to drop the lawsuit completely, if you agree to one thing." I looked at her wary, and that is, transfer 10% of the company stock to your grandchildren. Not to Blake, not to Camille, just Quentin and Laurel, for their future, for Charles's legacy. I sat still for a long moment, heart heavy. The children. They'd never called me grandma, barely spoke to me, but they were Charles's blood, his legacy. He would have liked that, I said quietly. He always wanted something left for them. Camille exhaled, a long shaking breath, as if she'd been holding it for months. "Then we'll withdraw the case tomorrow." And with that, she stood. Before leaving, she turned and looked at me, really looked at me. "I'm sorry it took so long for someone in our family to say this, but thank you for loving him." Then she was gone, and for the first time since Charles died, I felt like the war had ended, not with a gavel, but with grace. After Camille left, the silence in the house felt different, not hollow, not heavy, but clean, like a room finally aired out after a long winter. The next day, Daniel confirmed that the lawsuit had been officially withdrawn. A single sheet of legalese, no apology, no fanfare, just a quiet end to a very public battle. Still, It felt like closure. I signed the documents to transfer 10% of the company's shares into a trust for Quentin and Laurel. No strings attached. Whether they ever chose to run the business or sell or walk away entirely, that would be their decision. I didn't expect a thank you, but I received something better. A letter. Handwritten in neat but tentative cursive from Laurel. Dear Eleanor, I don't really know what to say. I just wanted you to know I saw the trial. I saw the video of Grandpa Charles. I saw the way you sat there, calm, kind, and never said anything bad about my dad, even when he did about you. Mom says you gave us a part of the company. I don't really understand what that means yet, but I promise I'll try to be someone he would have been proud of. And I'm sorry we never called you Grandma. I think maybe we just didn't understand who you really were. Thank you, Laurel. I read that letter at the kitchen table in the morning light with tears on my cheeks and my hands pressed to my heart. Not because it changed the past, but because it softened the future. With the legal storm behind me, I turned to what came next. The house no longer felt like a tomb, it felt like a beginning. I restored Charles's study into a reading room. I opened the garden he loved to the local senior center, where volunteers now helped grow herbs and flowers as part of therapy. And in the West Wing, I finally did something for myself. I opened a small grief counseling room. Quiet, softly lit, a place for widows and widowers who had nowhere to put their pain. Sometimes I just sit with them and listen. Sometimes I cry too. Because love leaves echoes, and some echoes never fade. It had been 3 months since the court case ended. Spring was soft that year in Charleston. Warm rain, cherry blossoms, mornings that smelled like wet earth and jasmine. The house had settled into its new rhythm. I had too. Then one afternoon, as I was organizing old boxes in the attic, boxes I'd long avoided, I found it. A plain white envelope. No postmark, no return address. Just one word written on the front in Charles's familiar script. Jenna. I paused, my heart thudding. That name. Jenna. It stirred a vague memory, something Charles had mentioned in passing years ago, back when we were first married. A friend from college. A long-lost chapter, he'd called it, half smiling, half guarded. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a letter, dated 3 years ago. Dear Jenna, I don't know if this will ever reach you. Maybe it's better if it doesn't, but I wanted to write it anyway. You deserve to hear it from me. I was a coward all those years ago. I should have told you the truth when I left, that I wasn't ready, that I thought love had to be earned through success, not just felt. But I was wrong, and by the time I realized it, you'd moved on, and so had I. Eleanor, she saved me in ways I can't explain. She didn't fix me, she just stood beside me until I figured out how to fix myself. And if by some miracle this does reach you, I hope you're well. I hope you're loved. And I hope you understand why I needed to say goodbye. Charles. My fingers trembled as I folded the letter back, not from jealousy, but from a bittersweet ache. Charles had loved deeply before me, and he had carried the weight of a goodbye for decades. That was who he was. A man who never ran from emotion, only from hurting others. I didn't know whether Jenna had ever read this letter, but I decided then she deserved to. I found her easily. Jenna McPherson, now 72, living in Asheville, a retired art teacher. I mailed the letter. No note, no explanation, Just the letter in a clean envelope with her name. 2 weeks later, I received a reply. Dear Eleanor, thank you. I hadn't heard from Charles in over 40 years, and when I read his words, it felt like time folded in on itself. I'm not bitter. We both found our paths, but knowing he found love, real love, that brings me peace. You must be a remarkable woman. I'm glad he had you. With warmth, Jenna. I closed the letter and smiled. Not all stories end in courtrooms or conflict. Some end in soft closure and quiet understanding between women who once loved the same man.
The invitation arrived in early June. It was from the board of Hollister Pharmaceuticals. They were organizing a memorial gala in Charles's honor, his life, his legacy, his contribution to the community. An evening to celebrate the man behind the mission. At the bottom of the card, in embossed gold, were the words, "We would be honored if Eleanor Hollister would speak." I stared at those words for a long time. Part of me recoiled. Public speaking had never been my strength, especially about something so personal. But another part of me, stronger, steadier, no, this wasn't about speaking well. It was about speaking truth. So I said yes. The event was held at the old Everblade Conservatory, beneath vaulted glass ceilings and rows of white linen tables. The company had spared no expense. A slideshow of Charles's life played in the background. Baby photos, wedding snapshots, ribbon cuttings at pharmacy grand openings. Blake and Camille were there too, seated quietly at a back table with their children. There was no animosity in their eyes now, just distance, like we'd all finally stopped fighting for the same space and learned to breathe on our own. When my name was called, I walked slowly to the podium. The room grew still. I looked out at the faces, employees, old friends, people who had known him through business or church or charity, but not through love, not the way I had. I cleared my throat, and I began. When I first met Charles Hollister, he wasn't a mogul. He wasn't even particularly confident. He was a man who had lost more than most people should bear, and yet he still opened the door for hope. That was his quiet superpower. He believed people could heal, that businesses could care, that love could come twice in a lifetime and still feel like the first. I paused, emotion catching in my throat. He didn't build Hollister Pharmaceuticals just to make money. He built it so no one would have to feel as helpless as he did when he lost his first wife. He built it for the sick, the lonely, the aging, and yes, for the ones who just needed to be seen. I glanced at the crowd. Even Blake had his eyes lowered now. He gave me a home, a purpose, and more than anything, he gave me peace. And tonight, I want to thank him for that. Not with applause, not with tributes, but with one promise, that I will continue his legacy not with ambition, but with heart. Silence. Then a slow rise of clapping, starting from the back. And then everyone stood. A standing ovation, not for the woman at the microphone, but for the man in every corner of their lives, Charles Hollister. As I stepped down, Laurel quietly approached me. She didn't say anything. She just hugged me. And in that moment, I knew, somewhere between loss and legacy, between war and grace, we had found each other.
A week after the memorial, I was dusting the shelves in Charles's study, something I did now with more reverence than routine, when I noticed it. A picture frame. It was one of our wedding photos, the smaller one he kept on the corner of his desk. But this time, when I lifted it to clean, I felt something rattle in the back. I turned it over. Taped behind the backing, yellowed with time, was a small folded piece of stationery. My breath caught in my chest. It was addressed to me, in Charles's handwriting. Not Eleanor, not Mrs. Hollister, just, "To my Ellie, if I never get the chance." My hands trembled as I peeled back the tape and unfolded the letter. The ink had faded a little, but the words were still crisp, his voice still alive on the page. "Ellie, if you're reading this, something happened before I could say what I needed to. First, I love you, always. That's the simplest truth in a life full of complicated days. You were never a second choice, never a replacement. You were the one who waited for me when I didn't even know I needed waiting for. Second, I'm sorry about Noel. I know he never opened his heart to you the way I hoped, and maybe that's my fault. I raised him with love, but not always with boundaries. I wanted to spare him pain, and in doing so, I may have kept him from learning how to truly love others. But I see the way you try, the quiet grace you show even when he's cold, the way you never speak ill of him, not even in private. I see it all, and I admire you more than I can say. If there ever comes a day when Noel challenges the will or your place in this family, I trust you to know what's right, not just legally, but morally. I've set some protections in place, not because I doubt your strength, but because I've seen the weight you carry. You deserve peace. You deserve respect. And you deserve to never doubt how much I saw your worth. Whatever happens after I'm gone, remember this. You were the greatest decision of my life. With all my love, Charles. I sank slowly into his old leather chair, the letter pressed against my chest, as if trying to draw his heartbeat back into the room. And for a long time, I just sat there. The past, the pain, the trials, none of it changed the fact that I had been deeply, unconditionally loved. And I wasn't alone. It started with a letter, not one I received, one I wrote, to Laurel. I had thought long about it after the memorial, after her hug, after seeing in her eyes something that had never existed in her father's, openness. So I sat at my desk, the same one Charles once used to build an empire out of compassion, and I wrote, "Dear Laurel, I wanted to thank you, not just for your presence at the gala, but for your warmth, for seeing me, for reaching across the silence that wasn't your fault. Families are complicated, legacies even more so, but you have something in you that reminds me of your grandfather, the quiet strength, the empathy, the awareness that hearts are more valuable than fortunes. If you ever want to know more about him, the real him, I'd be honored to share it. My door is always open. Warmly, Eleanor." I mailed it the next morning, not expecting anything, just hoping. 3 days later, she knocked on my door. No text, no call, just Laurel, standing on the porch with a notebook in her hand and a hesitant smile on her face. "I brought questions," she said shyly. I welcomed her in with tea and banana bread. We sat in the reading room where the fireplace still had the scent of cedar wood from winter. She asked about his childhood, his grief, his laugh, his favorite food, rosemary lamb chops, his favorite poem, Frost's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, his worst habit, staying up too late reviewing files. And I answered every one. Not from memory, but from love. It became a tradition,
Sunday afternoons, sometimes with Camille, sometimes just Laurel. Over time, she opened up, not just about her grandfather, but about her dreams. She wanted to study psychology, like me. Not because of me, because of what she saw in me, because of what she felt. I gave her a scholarship, quietly, anonymously, through a foundation Charles and I had once dreamed of starting, the Charles Hollister Fund for Human Compassion. That was the first step, but not the last.
There are moments in life when you realize that a chapter is truly closing, not with a bang, not with grief, but with peace, with stillness, with completion. I had lived through storms. I had stood alone in courtrooms, in kitchens filled with silence, in family portraits where I was always slightly off to the side. And yet, I had also been loved, deeply, fully, truly. So one morning, I sat down at my old oak desk where Charles once scribbled notes and I had once cried into unpaid bills and unanswered questions, and I wrote my final letter. But this time, it was not to Charles. It was not to Noelle. It was not to Laurel. It was to myself. Dear Ellie, you survived what many don't even speak about. You were the stranger in the family portrait, the quiet backbone of a man's empire, the stepmother who was never called mom. But you loved anyway. You gave without expectation. You stayed even when you were pushed out of every room. And now you have something they never saw coming. You have peace. You have purpose. You have the final word. Not because you fought for it, but because you waited long enough for the noise to fall away. And in that quiet, your voice is the only one that matters. You are not the woman who inherited a fortune. You are the woman who inherited a love story. And that story is yours to tell. Eleanor. That letter never went in an envelope. It sits in a frame now, on the same mantle where Charles once placed our wedding photo. Next to it, a new photo. Laurel, me, and a few new friends from the community center. We're smiling. No courtroom behind us, no will, no signatures. Just life. Still hard, still beautiful. But finally, mine.
If this story touched your heart, don't leave without letting me know. Life can be cruel sometimes, but stories like this, they remind us we're not alone. So go on, click that subscribe button. There are more stories waiting for you, real, raw, and full of truth. And if you've lived through something like this, share your story in the comments. I'm listening. We all are. Thank you for staying with me until the end. You matter. Your story matters.